My name is Josh Wolf, streaming live from the Antipodes in the future, where it is now Saturday, the 20th of February at approximately 8:09 p.m. And I am joined by our two interlocutors for today's debate, which is about the problem of evil. And we have from across the ditch in Australia, James Fodor. Welcome, James.
Thanks for having me.
And from the... Oh, I'm hearing myself speaking. Stop that. Okay, and we have from England, Ādi Puruṣa, dialing in from, it looks like a university dormitory or something similar.
No, just apartment.
Apartment. Welcome, Ādi Puruṣa. Thanks for calling in. So today's debate on Theology Unleashed is about the problem of evil. Why is there not enough evil in the world? Can we get some more? I'm not sure who's arguing for more evil, one of the two. There's also another problem of evil that I hear people talk about in a philosophical kind of sense. Why does evil exist? I'm personally of the opinion that we don't have enough of it, but some people are wondering, why does evil exist if there is a God who is all good? James's position, I'm just guessing here, is probably going to be that there is no God. He's known as the godless theist, which is an interesting position to take, kind of like taking the good and leaving the bad, I'd imagine. And Ādi Puruṣa is arguing this one from a theistic position. And welcome to our viewers today, Digital Gnosis, and Ginger Wolf 2000, who tuned in early because they thought that James Fodor was actually Stevie T, the gent guitarist. I don't know if you ever get that, but once they said it, I was like, yeah, he does kind of look like Stevie T. But James is the author of the book Unreasonable Faith, which you can get on Amazon. Ādi Puruṣa, do you have a book out at the moment?
Fortunately not.
Okay. So you're going to have to crib notes from Ādi Puruṣa's presentation today, but if you want to see more of James's kind of thinking on this, he has a blog and he also has the book Unreasonable Faith. So I'm going to get out of the way, and if you want to take a couple of minutes to maybe just introduce yourself at the beginning of your section, also kind of frame where you want this discussion to go. And Arjuna told me that Ādi Puruṣa is going to go first in this with like a 10-minute kind of introduction. Is that okay with the two of you, or do you have something else in mind?
Yeah, it's cool with me.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, and then we have one other question, which James asked me earlier. Ādi Puruṣa, do you prefer Ādi or Ādi Puruṣa?
Either one works, whatever you prefer.
Okay, well, James is from Australia, so it's going to be ads or Ādi. Okay, Ādi Puruṣa, over to you for the opening statements on the problem of evil.
Cool, thanks for having me on here. So I'm Ādi Puruṣa. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge, and my dissertation is basically on the Hare Krishna response to the problem of evil. So actually, I should probably just briefly explain the problem of evil for those of you that may not know. So the problem of evil generally supposes that God is all good, all-powerful, and all-knowing, yet it also asserts that there's evil in the world. And the main argument is that the amount of evil that we witness in the world is inconsistent with an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God. And theologians and philosophers have tried to address this problem by putting forth Theodicy, which basically tries to make sense of the evil that we witness in the world. So I'll basically put forward the Hare Krishna Theodicy, which has, basically it has three parts. So the first part is that originally each individual was living in we can say like a super mundane or like a spiritual world with God. And we were living there happily, and in this realm, in this world, there was no evil. We were just, living a very blissful life in the presence of God. Then on account of our free will, some individuals decided to leave that world and come down into this world. So it's basically sort of like it's sometimes described as kind of like a fall. Basically, the soul or the self was curious to know what life was like apart from God, and it came down into this world and chose to leave God. So that's the first part of it. And the next part is that once the self is in the world, this world is structured by like the laws of karma. So for our actions have consequences, and the law of karma basically states that any action that we do is met with a consequence that's in proportion to the moral quality of the act that we perform. And on top of that, these laws of karmas, if one becomes a devotee of God, then these laws of karmas basically, they don't work in quite the same way. God sort of overrides these karmic laws, and at that point, God personally orchestrates the events in a devotee's life in order to intensify their love for God. So basically, the root reason why there's evil is because we've chosen to leave God, and the reason that we were allowed to leave God, or that we chose to leave God, is because God endows us with free will. And free will is valuable because it allows us to have a loving relationship with God that's not coerced or forced in any way. But a consequence of free will, if free will is to be truly meaningful, is that God can't override our free will. You know, if God could create us with free will, but then choose to override our free will and control us, then that would basically be a contradiction. You know, a self with free will who's also controlled is like a square circle. It doesn't exist. So because we have this free will, God basically can't force us or coerce us to act against our best interest, or to act for our best interest, I mean. So the root reason is the self leaves because of free will. And then also these karmic laws that I've talked about, I should also note that their purpose is not to punish us per se. Their purpose is to rectify our consciousness and teach us lessons so that we can develop the character needed to become devotees of God. And sort of the rough way it works is this. So you do an action, let's say, you know, I punch, I don't know, I punch someone in the face. My karmic reaction for that would be to get punched in the face back. And this karmic reaction is not meant to just punish me for punishment's sake, but it's meant to basically teach me a lesson in sensitivity. Because when I get punched in the face, I can experience what that feels like. And having experienced what that feels like, I'm basically able to become more sensitive, and I can realize, oh, wow, like getting punched in the face hurts. Like, you know, this causes pain. I experience what this pain is like. I wouldn't want to cause this to anyone else. And through this way, you can learn various lessons. I should also note that every time you sort of experience something, it leaves what's called, in Sanskrit, a samskara, or we can translate it as an impression. So the various experiences that we have leave impressions on our mind, and these impressions stay with us as we continue to reincarnate. Also, the Hare Krishna Theodicy basically has reincarnation in it. So if I get punched in the face, that experience leaves an impression on my mind that sort of stays with me and helps to help me shape my behavior. And yeah, as I mentioned also, if someone becomes a devotee of God, the sort of karmic rules can be overridden, and God personally orchestrates different events in a devotee's life so that they can become closer to God. So if I had to sum it up, basically evil exists because of free will. Because we have free will, God can't control us, and God can't prevent us from making bad choices. But God is not the one causing us to suffer. The suffering comes as a result of our misguided choices. So that's, I guess that's my part.
All right, cool. Thanks for that, Adi. So I'll just take a few minutes to articulate my approach to this and also present some, I guess, questions that then we can discuss a bit more over the course of the discussion. So, my name is James. Obviously, I'm an atheist and a materialist. So I don't believe in sort of spirits or magical forces or karma or gods or anything like that. So that's the sort of framework I'm coming from. As was said before, I've written a book about responding to various apologetic arguments made by Christian apologist William Lane Craig. So that's where I have most familiarity. I've had some interaction with different worldviews as well, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to discuss this. I think it's an important issue. So with respect to the problem of evil, I think it is a good argument against the existence of an all-powerful and all-loving God, but not a decisive one. So I'm not going to argue that it is sort of a definitive argument or piece of evidence against the existence of God, but I do think it's a weighty consideration, or it should be a weighty consideration. So there's different formulations of the problem of evil, and I don't really want to get too, well, I mean, we can discuss it if we think it's relevant, but I don't personally think the precise form is the most important thing, because I think there's an underlying logic behind it. So I'll just articulate a form that I think is sort of interesting that might be useful for discussion later. So the argument will go something like this. So the first premise would be there are many forms of apparently pointless suffering in the world. So this would include moral suffering, or suffering resulting from moral evils like choices by people, as well as suffering resulting from natural evils, like natural disasters and disease and so on. The second premise would be the best explanation for the existence of so much apparently pointless suffering is that the universe is indifferent to our suffering. Or in other words, there's no sort of overarching agent or consciousness or God or anything like that is sort of concerned about our suffering. And the conclusion then from that would be, because the hypothesis of an indifferent universe is able to explain the existence of so much apparently pointless suffering, there's good reason to believe that the universe is in fact indifferent to our suffering. And I think it would sort of follow from that there's no God in the classical sense of, an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. So that's just a sketch of an argument that might be helpful. So I take it as a sort of an inference to the best explanation about the way the world is with respect to the amount of suffering that exists. So that's something I'll put out there for further discussion. And now I'll just raise a few sort of issues or thoughts with respect to some of the things that Ādi shared, because basically what Ādi's presented is the outline of a theodicy, which is a sort of an explanation for why God allows evil, which if sort of it was successful, then would serve as a rebuttal or a defense for the sort of argument that I've articulated. But I have some questions with the proposed theodicy, because I'm not really sure that it succeeds. So I'll just sort of mention them, and then we can go through and discuss them in more detail. So one of the questions I have is, why is it good, or why is it the most fundamental good to have a loving relationship with God? So I would sort of question about the basis of that as the underlying basis of what goodness is, because it's not clear to me that what is true, it's obviously not true from my worldview, but also why that would sort of follow from a theistic worldview. So that's one question. A related question is, why does having a loving relationship with God require free will? Because it's not obvious to me that a loving relationship and free will are necessarily related to each other. They seem distinct concepts to me. So I've sort of not convinced about that. The third question is, if God does want agents to enter into a loving relationship with him or to be devoted to him, then why did he not just create agents who would freely choose to do that? Why did he create agents who would then choose to leave his presence and enter into a world where there would be so much suffering? It's unclear to me why an all-loving, all-good God would do that. And then I think the last sort of set of questions all relate to the nature of our world specifically. So in particular, why does God, why does the world we live in have so much natural evil? So like, disasters, diseases, and things like that, things that aren't directly a consequence of human choices, at least apparently not. And a related issue is, why does God allow the commission of particularly horrific actions by people? Well, I can give more examples of that later on, but it's not clear that free will requires the God to refrain from intervening when there are particularly heinous actions being committed. So I would sort of question about that. And a final thing that I'll mention is my concern about, I don't actually remember if Ādi mentioned this in his opening remarks, but he has discussed this in a previous debate with T-Jump, which I watched in preparation. So I'll put this out there now, which is the idea that all of the things that happen in this life ultimately have a purpose in helping us to, I guess, return to or grow closer to God. And so that even things that are apparently really horrific or cause a lot of suffering have a greater purpose. And I would sort of question why we would think that that's the case, or how that could be the case given certain examples, which would seem to be very implausible that there's a greater purpose, or that that's sort of the best way that God could have devised of achieving a greater purpose. If he's omnipotent and omnibenevolent and omniscient, then it would seem that he would be able to achieve his purposes without requiring so much sort of suffering in between. So those are some questions that I have at the outset, and I think I'll end my opening remarks there, and we can sort of chat about some of these points.
Okay, yeah. So those are interesting points.
So feel free to grab on any of those threads, and we can start chatting.
Yeah, I've written them down. I'm thinking which ones to. So the indifference thesis we can maybe come back to later. It's interesting, but I think some other ones are more pertinent right now. So I guess I'll start with the first one. Why is it good to have a relationship with God? My response would be that God is the greatest being in existence. He's also he's like the source of all pleasure according to our theology. He's his body itself is described as having being composed of bliss, and he's just the greatest being in existence, and the highest happiness that we can achieve is, maybe if I can put it like this, so God is the greatest being in existence, and the greatest happiness we can achieve is by having a relationship with the greatest being. So the highest happiness that we can achieve is by having a relationship with God. As for why specifically the greatest happiness is to have a relationship with the greatest being, I mean, we can observe in this world that relationships give us pleasure. One of the most fulfilling things in this world is to have a relationship with someone that you love. And so we can at least observe in this world that relationships give us happiness. So it would make sense that a relationship with God would bring us the highest happiness that we can achieve. And
yeah,
actually maybe...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And even more specific than relationship, because you can have a relationship with your coworker, you can have a relationship with your employer, you can have a relationship with a lot of things, but what's important in the relationship is love. And we can see that love in this world is one of the greatest forms of happiness. So it makes sense that developing this loving relationship with God would also be the greatest source of happiness.
Yeah, so that part is reasonable enough to me. The idea that if there was such a being, then us having a loving relationship with them would be the greatest possible source of happiness. That doesn't worry me so much, but that response is, well, again, I don't know as much about sort of Hare Krishna theology, so you might have to help me a bit here, but that response seems to indicate to me that the locus of morality is actually the experience of sentient beings, because what you've said is that it is good for us to have a loving relationship with God because of the fact that will allow us to achieve our ultimate level of happiness. So that's grounding the goodness in actually our experience as agents. Would you agree with that?
I would sort of say that the highest good ultimately is that which leads to the greatest happiness. So in one sense, I've sort of talked about this with T-Jump also. I don't know if you mentioned that, but basically in our theology, there's two different types of goodness, basically. One is called prayas, which is like things that are immediately beneficial, like just like temporary pleasure. And another good is this relationship with God. And my view is that basically the morals that we have and that are mentioned in Scripture specifically are there to guide us towards developing our character so that we can achieve this love. So in one sense, when you fully develop your love, you will act according to certain moral principles, like being truthful, being compassionate, just various saintly qualities, we can say. Various saintly qualities. So the more I guess goodness and morality are sort of interconnected in this way. Like the more you develop moral qualities, the more you're able to have a relationship with God, and the loving relationship with God is the highest good.
Yeah. So would you say that? Oh, we've got a.
Yeah, I just want to jump in for a second.
Floating chair.
Yeah, hang on a second. Let me just shift this around like this, move my head this way. Now, Ādi, we had people in the chat saying that they could hear you typing when James was speaking before, as you were taking notes, which I think means that you're using the microphone on your laptop rather than that other mic in front of you. If you just go down to that little cog underneath the Restream window and click settings, you can change your audio input there, and you should be able to turn your mic on.
Oh, okay. How about this? Is this better?
It sounds different. Still clicking.
What about this?
Sounds still kind of the same.
Should I just plug in my mic again?
Yeah, just try unplugging it and plugging it in again. Windows, the source of all evil. What did they say? Power corrupts. PowerPoint corrupts. Absolutely.
All right. I don't know if this is any better.
Can you try just tapping on your laptop keyboard? Let's see if it's no, it's not that mic. Okay, we tried. I did my best. I'm going to jump back out and just remember that when you're typing, Ādi, if you could taking notes, if you could just mute your microphone. That was me that time, bumping mine. Sorry to interrupt you in mid thought stream there, James. I think you were about to make a point.
Yeah, no worries. So what I was going to ask about, this is lost train of thought a bit there. So ultimate good is grounded in our happiness. Yeah. So I'm curious as to what you think about the idea of, well, Craig talks about it as divine aseity. I don't know if that's a concept, if that sort of word applies, but the idea that God is sort of self-sufficient. If that's the case, then it's hard for me to see how it can be the case that the fundamental sort of grounding of goodness is the experience of happiness of conscious creatures, because that seems to imply that when God creates, beings that are able to experience happiness, then the universe is sort of better than in a moral sense, like has a greater moral value than if God just existed by himself. Would you affirm that?
Well, one point is that in our theology, it's not so much that God creates in the Christian sense. It's, like selves are also exist a se in the same way that God does, and the world also exists a se. So God doesn't, it's not that God exists and then he creates the world and then he creates like selves. They're all sort of eternally existent, and they all exist, they say, but they're grounded. Their existence is grounded in God's existence. Which, I guess the problem still remains. I would still say that the world is better by having agents that are capable of loving God. God, he experiences happiness when his devotees have a loving relationship with him, and the cells have experience happiness by having a loving relationship. So the world is, on the whole, a happier place by allowing for other selves to exist and for them to have a relationship with God.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, that seemed to follow from what you'd said, so I was just clarifying that. But that actually leads on to one of the other questions that I had, which was about God creating only souls who would freely choose to love him. So this is interesting because, so does it follow from what you say that God kind of doesn't have control over what souls exist?
He sustains their existence. So in one sense, in one sense, he doesn't create them, but he has control over them in the sense that he sustains their existence. So, he could theoretically choose to sustain them in a different way, and maybe he creates them free, but then at another point he decides to control them. We could say that hypothetically God would have that ability. And I guess so. It seems like you're sort of segueing into your next objection, which is why couldn't God just choose to create cells that freely chose the good? That's what I was
saying, because it seems to follow from what you just mentioned there.
Yeah. So I have a argument why God couldn't freely choose. Why God couldn't, let's say sustain in this case. Why God couldn't sustain cells that freely chose the good. So one, I uphold the principle of alternate possibilities. So if you're free with respect to an action, you have to have the ability to do otherwise. I know that's a little bit controversial, but for now, I'll just say that that's sort of just, I'll go with that assumption. So I have this is an argument for my dissertation. Maybe I should have sent this earlier, but basically, let's say for the sake of argument that God can actually this might be a little bit, okay, so basically my definition of goodness for God is that if God is good, he necessarily does what's good. This may not be so common in other theological circles, but that's the definition I go with. So if something is good, leads to the greatest good, and it's within God's power to do it, then God will necessarily do it. So there'll be no possible world where God fails to act in accordance with the highest good. So let's say that God could actualize a world where all selves freely choose the good. If it's logically possible for God to do this, and it does in fact lead to the highest good, then on my definition of God's goodness, then God would necessarily actualize a world where all selves would freely choose the good. But then if necessarily all selves freely chose the good, then there would be no possible world where selves did not freely choose the good, or made a mistake. Basically, they acted wrongly. But if there's no possible world where selves are capable of basically going wrong with respect to an action, they're not really free with respect to that action, because the principle of alternate possibilities holds that they have to have the ability to do otherwise. So basically, if God had, if it was logically possible, basically it's like God can't actualize a world where selves freely choose the good, because if that was possible, God would necessarily do it. But if God necessarily did that, then there'd be no possible world where selves could act wrongly, and that would violate the principle of alternate possibilities, and selves wouldn't really be free in that case.
Yeah, so I get the impression that this may be a more technical argument, and so it's potentially difficult for me to evaluate just based on that. But it didn't sound to me like that necessarily followed, because what I'm asking is why didn't God create a universe in which there are, or sustained souls, whatever language you want to say, which freely choose to follow him, or let's just say follow him. I didn't say why didn't he create a world in which all the souls necessarily follow him. So that's a different claim, right? So I'm not saying that for each soul that exists in every possible world, that soul will follow God. All I'm saying is there's a world that God creates in which, in that world, every soul chooses to follow God. See, there could be other worlds in which they chose not to, but then God doesn't actualize those. He actualizes the one in which they all choose to. See, the fact that a free agent has a choice to act otherwise doesn't mean that they sort of have to choose otherwise. It just means that they could, right? It could just be the case that they all do actually choose to follow God. And I don't see anything logically contradictory about that. I mean, isn't God a free agent who could choose otherwise, but just always does choose to do the good thing? Like, couldn't other agents do likewise?
I would actually argue that God his free will is sort of a little bit compatibilist, in the sense that he acts in accordance with his nature, and his nature is the highest good. So God couldn't really act God couldn't really act wrongly.
Well, you say he couldn't or just won't? Because those are different claims, right? This is sort of what I'm getting at here.
Yeah. I would say that God couldn't, but okay, so I also would say that the free will that God has and the free will that we have is also slightly different. So God would have a more like compatibilist account of free will where he couldn't act evil. We would have a more...
Sorry, finish.
Yeah, we would have a more, I guess, libertarian sense where we, like, it's not that our nature is such that we're like causally determined to always act for the good. So our nature is not such that we're always sort of forced to act in accordance with the good.
Okay, well, this is a very interesting response. So you've said that God and us have somewhat different types of free will. So which is a morally better type of free will to have? The one that God has or the one that we have?
I guess so let's speak about this in terms of the love that one can experience in a loving relationship, because that's sort of what's described more in our theology. So when you have the type of free will that cells have, when you have the ability to act otherwise, then when you have a loving relationship, it becomes more meaningful because you actually have the option to not be in that relationship. So when you choose that relationship, again, like when you choose that relationship, even though you could have done otherwise, it takes on more meaning. So souls have the ability to not have a relationship with God. They have the ability to have a relationship with God. They have the ability not to have a relationship with God. When they have because they have the free choice, because they actually have both these choices available to them, they experience greater love in their relationship with God than they would have if they just had one choice. Now, this seems to, if you follow this, then it seems that because God only has one choice, love souls, that his love is slightly diminished. And that's actually what our theology says. It says that the devotee actually experiences greater love in the relationship with God than God experiences. So there's more theology that can be gotten into, but God actually desires to experience the love that his devotee has because it's actually a superior love to his. We can...
But you just said before God is the greatest being in existence, but now God can't experience the highest form of love. That seems very odd to me. Why would I worship a God that can't even experience the highest form of love? That's really strange.
Yeah, in our theology, God, he can, because he's also capable of basically assuming the emotions of his devotee. Like he basically takes an avatar, which is not quite like an incarnation. An avatar means one who descends. God basically coming down to this world. So God can actually assume an avatar where he experiences the love of his devotee. So God can actually experience this love, just through this, by assuming an avatar. It's maybe a slightly different conception of greatness also, but I guess it's, for our theology, that's not seen as too problematic, that the devotee experiences more love than God.
Okay, so that's interesting. That's certainly a different conception than I'm used to, but I think we'll just put that to the side because obviously I can't really say much about that other than that's what your theology holds. But we originally came onto this point because I asked about the idea that, so I said, well, God is an agent who always chooses the good, and you sort of disagreed with that because you were saying that God has a somewhat different form of free will than we do. So let me walk back from that a bit, because evidently that example doesn't hold. But I would still sort of press the point that it still seems to me conceivable that you would have a libertarian agent who could always choose otherwise, but just always does in the actual world choose the good. and therefore it's not logically inconsistent for God to sustain, let's say, a soul or souls who have the ability to do otherwise, but just always do actually choose the good.
Yeah, I mean, the argument I gave mentioned why that was. I mean, it's probably easier to see it on paper, but
well, that's what I was saying. But it sounded like what you were saying is that it would have to be necessarily the case that agents would choose the good, but that's not what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
If it were necessarily the case we would choose the good, then a soul would choose the good in every possible world, and then they wouldn't have the ability to do otherwise. So I agree that would be a contradiction,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't see why a soul would have to necessarily choose the good, just that they would choose the good in the actual world, like the one that God creates and sustains.
Actually, I guess, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but it's not that every soul falls either. So
Sorry, every soul what?
It's not that every soul falls. So one of our spiritual teachers, he says that only about like 10% of souls actually fall. So for like 90% of souls, it's possible, you know, they basically always freely choose the good. It's just like a small percentage that don't choose to.
Fair enough. So I guess the question would be, why does God sustain a 90% like that and then 10% not like that? Why not 100% like that?
Yeah, I guess, you know, free will means that God can't interfere with the free will. So if you were to interfere with the free will by somehow, you know, I don't know, zapping them out of existence if they made a wrong choice, or overriding their free will when they decided to act otherwise, it would basically violate their free will. I mean, if the self is free to do whatever it wants, then there can't be any agent coercing it to act otherwise.
Oh, sure, but God doesn't need to coerce us. All he needs to do is, I mean, because presumably God knows the future if he's omniscient, right? So he just sort of, I mean, because you say God doesn't exactly create souls, I'm not entirely sure what language to use, but at least the idea, if God does have some sort of creative role, is that he just creates the souls that always choose. It's not like he creates them and then says, oh, wait, this one's going to do the wrong thing, and so I'll sort of prevent you from doing that. It's just that he doesn't create that soul in the first place. Now, maybe it's a more sustaining role at sort of the beginning of time. I don't know how you would frame that in your theology, but it seems like that you could still construct that argument to be saying the same thing. If there's 90% are already like that, I guess I'm going to ask, why is there a residual 10% that God doesn't create or sustain or whatever in the same way, so that they all choose to have that highest level of happiness?
Yeah, so so maybe you're sort of getting along lines of like God could just orchestrate circumstances so that each self would really choose the good, like he would
exactly.
maybe. Okay. Yeah, so I think it comes back to the principle of alternative possibilities. Like if God were to do that, like, or, you know, for every soul, like God organizes the circumstances to where like they cannot fall. I think if God were to do that for every soul, then, you know, like realistically, like no soul could actually leave. You know, metaphysically, it might be possible for them to leave, but like it would never obtain that they leave.
Yeah, that's the point. God would create or sustain it such that they never would, even if they could. So it retains the principle of alternative possibilities by allowing there to be a possible world in which they do choose that, but they just don't.
Yeah, but I would say if in every possible world, a self doesn't choose to fall, then, you know, if every single possible world that you can conceive of, the self doesn't fall, then even though it's metaphysically possible, it's not like maybe logically possible. I don't know, I think if the self is actually free with respect to an agent, there has to be like a, I don't know, maybe logically possible world.
Yeah.
I mean,
by the principle of alternative possibilities, I agree. I mean, I personally don't agree with that as a conception of free will, but I'm going to put that to the side because that's a whole other discussion, right? So just accepting that for the framework here. Yeah, so let me try to have one more go at what I'm trying to say here. So let's think about all the different possible worlds for every soul. And so take a soul, and then throughout their life, or their, I don't know what you call it exactly because they've reincarnated, right? But there's many decisions that they make. And you could imagine that each time they can choose the good choice or the bad choice, just for simplicity. So there's, you know, maybe there's billions or trillions of choices that they make. Maybe there's an infinite number, I don't know. But there's heaps and heaps of choices. And you can imagine that for all the different souls. And so you could imagine sort of specifying all of the different possible worlds in terms of the choices made by different souls. And you could, some worlds, like the souls are making all sorts of horrific choices. And then in some worlds, they're making some better choices. And then some that there's a bit of mixture, right? Now, presumably there's at least one possible world in which every soul always makes a good choice. Now, I'm not saying every possible world is like that. Maybe there's only one possible world that's like that. The question is, why doesn't God actualize or sustain that possible world?
Yeah, I mean, God is omnipotent. I mean, very few philosophers or theologians say that God can do the logically impossible. So it's, perhaps it's just logically impossible for God to actualize such a world.
Right.
I mean, that's probably the simplest response.
Yeah, I think that is the most straightforward response. I'm not personally not persuaded by that, but obviously I can't prove that it would be because I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't say what God could and couldn't do. It would seem to me that God should. I would expect, by the sort of hypothesis as stated, that that's the sort of universe I would expect to see. But if you just sort of say, well, it's just not possible, then, well, okay, we're at an impasse.
Yeah, I mean, I would ultimately say it's just not within God's power to actualize such a world. I mean, that would, I don't know, like, yeah, I guess free will is such that you can't coerce or force agents, so it's just, somehow or other it's, I mean, maybe it could be elaborated more, but I think I'll stay with that it's not, it's just logically impossible to actualize such a world.
All right, fair enough. So, I mean, I think that's about as much as we can say about that point. But that's sort of those sort of three questions about, those questions about why is it good to have a loving relationship and requirement for free will, and why doesn't God create or sustain souls that freely choose? That's sort of a preface for understanding how the theology relates to suffering. So, or the Theodicy, I guess. So, I guess now maybe we could talk, if you like, about why is it that this world that we live in, why is there so much suffering in this world? So except for the sake of argument that God can't force people to choose good, nor can he just actualize a world where everyone just happens to. So some people are going to choose to do the wrong thing. We'll just accept that for the moment. But we still have to ask the question: why do we see as much suffering as we do in the current world? So that's the question that I'll put forward to start with.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, there's karma, but I think it's also worth noting at this point that time is cyclical within Hindu thought and within our theology. So there's different types of ages that the world goes through. So the first stage is Satya Yuga, where it's the most righteous and morally righteous and good type of age. Then after that, there's Treta Yuga, where there's slightly more immorality and unrighteousness introduced. Then you have Dwapara Yuga, where there's even more. And then you have Kali Yuga, which is the age we live in, where it's basically the most corrupt of these ages. And I mean, my view is that there's also, it's getting more into cosmology here, but there's different universes. There's multiple universes within like the material world itself. And my view is that there's probably universes that are in their Satya Yuga now. There's universes that are in their Treta Yuga now. There's universes that are in the Dwapara Yuga now. And the particular universe, or even the particular planet now that we're in, happens to be in Kali Yuga, which is the most morally corrupt of these ages. So when you take that into consideration, that this is basically one of the most unrighteous ages that are there in this material world, it makes sense that we witness a lot of evil. It's not that every universe will have the amount that we witness, but we just happen to be in a universe that is in this sort of the worst sort of moral age, and the age with the most badness, you could say. So that when you take that into consideration, it's also, in my view, less surprising that we see so much evil, because this just happens to be one of the worlds where souls who have a lot of heavy karma to experience, or who have the sort of qualities that would warrant them having a birth in this type of universe, go to. So that is one reason why there's a lot of evil. It just, it's just the universe where people with a lot of karmic baggage go to. then why? So why is there so much evil?
Well, I actually said suffering, but you can use
suffering.
evil if you prefer. Some people think the distinction is important, but it may not be to you.
I take them as more or less synonymous. I think for the purposes of a debate like this, yeah, we can take them as synonymous. So that sort of answers one aspect of that question, but I get the sense you probably also want to know, like, teleologically, why there's so much evil. Like, what purpose does all this suffering purpose?
This could be one of the worst universes, but it'd still be have a lot less suffering than it does, right? So there's still a question, because the fundamental logic of the problem of evil, as I understand it at least, is to sort of compare worldviews and see which one best accounts for the moral state of the world that we see. And from my point of view, what I described as an indifferent universe accounts for it better. Because if there was a God who was trying to help us to, sort of return to him or become devotees of him, then I'm not sure that I would expect. In fact, I don't think I would expect to see the sorts of apparently purposeless suffering that we do. So even if you want to say, well, this is one of the worst universes, to me, that doesn't necessarily answer the question. I'm like, well, but why is it like this in the first place?
Oh, okay. Yeah, as I mentioned, suffering, or we'll go with suffering now. Suffering is, I mean, this might sound a little bit sadistic, but suffering is basically there to teach us lessons and reform our character so that we can ultimately come to God. So let's say we had a world where it's just like a total hedonistic paradise, like there's like streams of like, I don't know, like soda that you can drink to your heart's content. There's, like all sorts of pleasures available to you. God could create such a producer, God could make such a world like that, but a world that's just like a hedonistic paradise wouldn't be one where we would really be able to develop our characters and turn towards God. We would, we would basically be very content in a hedonistic paradise, and we would have no reason to want to develop a relationship with God. And that would actually, in the long term, serve to give us less happiness than if we were to suffer temporarily, but then enjoy a life of eternal bliss with God. So, so I mean, that's at least a reason why God doesn't create this world as like a hedonistic paradise. Suffering is basically there to teach us lessons, and even if it's heavy sometimes, that the benefits of having to undergo a heavy experience can ultimately lead to the greater good if it helps reform a soul's like character so that they can ultimately come to turn towards God.
Right. So what you're saying, although you may project the label, but it sounds analogous to me to what's sometimes called a soul-making theodicy in Christian Christian theology. So one issue that I have with this, I mean, I think it's a major issue, so I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, is that it seems to be saying that suffering on earth does serve a purpose, and that is basically reforming our souls, helping us ultimately return to God. Okay, so fair enough, that's a good purpose. But the question is the means, right? So as on earth, we would generally say, if you can achieve a purpose at let's say a lower cost or in an easier way or in a way that has less negative side effects, then you should always choose that if you can, if there's sort of, ceteris paribus, there's nothing else of comparable value that you have to give up. Now, in our imperfect world, we often have to make sacrifices. You can't, you have to upset some people to gratify other people, or you have to cause some suffering to cause a greater benefit. The question is why God has to make these sorts of trade-offs, especially when you consider the amount of suffering that there is on earth. Why can't God reform souls in a better way that doesn't require so much suffering? Because he's supposed to be omnipotent, right? So why does he have to choose what seems to be a very suboptimal way of getting to the result that he wants?
Just for like comparison's sake, do you have like a other notion of how God could achieve this soul making?
Oh, well, he's God, right? He can click his fingers and achieve the same effect that it would that would happen as a result of us going through the experience. Because whatever happens when we go through the experience is some sort of change that occurs, right? But God could just bring about that change without having to go through the experience. Why is God limited by the sequence of events that occurs in the material world to bring about a given effect? He could just do that because he's omnipotent.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say that like the soul has to want that change to happen. Let's say God really wants us to just sort of get it and become pure and come to him. On God's end, he's willing to do that. But let's say on our end, we're not. Then God can't just snap his fingers and make us change if it's our desire to not want that change. So the change actually has to come intrinsically from the soul. The God can't just override the soul.
But it doesn't, though, according to what you've said. It comes extrinsically through the circumstances that we go through that cause a change internally. Why can't God achieve that change through means that don't require suffering? You just said he can't do that, but I'm not going to accept that because you've said he's omnipotent. Unless there's a logical impossibility there, I just don't see why he can't do that. It's not logically impossible because it occurs, right? Apparently, you've said that we go through the suffering and that we change. So the change is possible. I'm asking, why does God have to use that means to achieve that outcome?
Well, I guess the change comes within because we're faced with these experiences. But, what other means than providing an experience that causes us to change internally would do the trick? I mean, I don't know. If God just snapped our fingers, it's not like there would be any extrinsic event that causes us to make an internal change.
Yes, it would. God would exert his causal power to bring that about. To bring about whatever it is into us that needs to change. The same thing that are changed by the circumstances that we go through, God would bring that about just without having to go through the suffering in the meantime.
Actually, now that as I mentioned before, God does sort of override these karmic laws for devotees. So in one sense, God can do that for his devotees. If someone's sort of practicing the path of devotion to him, then God, he can make it so that, he orchestrates the situations in a slightly different way. But for people that aren't devotees of God, God mainly has them be under the laws of karma because souls have to want God to intervene in their life. So, God can't just snap his fingers and change unless someone is actually desiring God to intervene in their life. So for souls that don't want God's intervention, they don't want anything to do with God. God doesn't intervene in their life. He lets them live their life as it is, but he structures the world with these laws of karma so that they can learn lessons through these laws without him having to directly intervene and thus override their free will.
Okay, so let me have another shot at expressing this idea. So God creates a world that operates through karmic forces, right? Those karmic forces are a set of causes that have various effects. And among those effects are effects that lead to changes in, let's say, intrinsic changes in people's desires. And and karmic forces can exert the effect of changing people's desires, maybe not everyone, but at least some people changing their desires to direct them towards wanting God to help them. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So what we've established is that God creates forces that have effects that cause people to change and want to direct themselves back to him. The question is why God is required to use the cause of karmic forces to bring about the effect of change in persons. Why can't God immediately or directly actualize the effect that those causes have? Why is God constrained to bring about the effect of changing the persons and redirecting themselves towards God through the karmic forces with the side effect of all this suffering? Why not just directly actualize that effect?
Because that in order to actualize the effect, there has to be some extrinsic event that causes it. And the laws of karma are the most optimal ways of orchestrating those extrinsic events.
Well, you just said that, I feel that's question begging. You just said in order to actualize effect, there has to be an external cause. I mean, why? Or maybe to put it another way, why can't God exerting their causal power be that external effect? Why does it have to be the suffering through the karmic forces? It doesn't seem very persuasive to me. It seems pretty ad hoc, to be honest. You're just saying, well, that's just the way it is. Well, I mean, okay, if that's where we're at, then fine. But to me, this is just very unpersuasive. It sounds very contrived. It's just like, well, God's all powerful, but he can't just actualize this effect. For some reason, he just has to do it this circuitous way that requires all this suffering.
I mean, I think about this. So I don't like, on your view, you're thinking God can just like, I don't know, snap his finger. Like someone, let's say someone struggles with like violence. You know, they have violent tendencies and they have a lot of problems with violence. Why couldn't God just like snap his fingers and all of a sudden, like that soul is now no longer violent?
Yep.
So, well, like I mentioned first, the soul has to want to change. So if the soul, you know, does, or not want to change, well, it has to want to change, it also has to want God to intervene in their life. So if a soul doesn't want God to intervene in their life, you know, God couldn't just like decide, oh, you know, this guy's a little bit violent right now, I'm just going to snap him into being less violent. Like, you can't do that for someone that doesn't want God's intervention.
But you've said he can. You've said God can do that. He just has to do it indirectly via the karmic forces. I'm saying, why not directly? But this is the whole point. You're saying God can achieve this effect. It just has to be through the means of karmic forces, because that's the point of them, according to you. I'm asking, why does he have to use that means? And you keep saying, no, he can't, because he can't do that. But according to your theology, as I understand it, he can bring about that. God can bring about that effect. He just has to use this mechanism. And I don't understand why he has to use this mechanism, because he's supposed to be omnipotent and omniscient. It's like, this is the best he could come up with, sort of thing, which seems a bit ad hoc and not very persuasive to me.
I would say that putting people in a world where there are mechanisms in place that allow people to learn the lessons in the most optimal way is not quite ad hoc.
Oh, no, I mean, it wouldn't if it was the most optimal way, but I'm saying it's not because of all the suffering. Horrific suffering. And I can give examples, but I'm sure you know what I have in mind. Like, that doesn't sound very optimal to me.
I got one for you. I'm going to jump in here with something randomly. I don't accept this basic premise of this idea of, like, you know, people learning stuff in the world. But if I were to accept that, it's like I could do my son's homework for him every night. And he might be in his room going like, oh, I hate this, it sucks, I don't want to do it. And I could just walk in there and like do it for him, but that's not going to be good for him. He's not going to learn anything that way. So you could look at it that way, right? That God does it in order for people to learn something through the experience of it. Just throwing that out there.
Yeah, and that is the sort of thing that people will say. My concern is that God's supposed to be omnipotent. So in our world, we often do have to cause harm to bring about a greater good, but that's because we're limited. I don't see why we would ever choose to do that if we could actualize the same effect without the harm. Like, for example, if we could bring about a case where our kids could learn without having to force them to go to school, do homework or whatever, then I'm not sure why we wouldn't do that, assuming there wouldn't be any sort of negative consequences of doing that.
Well, they'd turn into snowflakes, wouldn't they? Helicopter.
Yeah, but that's because that's how our world works. We're not omnipotent. We can't control all these other things. God isn't like that. It feels like that what we're doing is saying God's omnipotent, but then when I ask questions like, well, how come he does it in a way that brings about all this suffering? Suddenly there are all these constraints that just come out from nowhere particular.
Well, no, I mean, basically, your argument boils down to this. If you accept that there's this omnipotent God who made the universe, he made it the way he made it, and your argument basically is, why didn't he make it the way I want it to be? Because he just made it the way he wanted it to be. Right.
No, that's not the argument at all. The argument is, so this is why I presented the argument in a sort of simple syllogism at the start to give a sort of a framework. The argument is we see the world as it is with a lot of suffering in it. Well, particularly apparently pointless suffering. And I still want to talk about that pointless part. But so we see that in the world. And the question is, what worldview best accounts for, you know, the world being that way? Now, one worldview, or maybe it's not one, but a certain worldview say that there's an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God who is sort of orchestrating everything. And then another worldview says, which I've just called an indifferent universe, says that there isn't such a thing. Now, I'm arguing that the way the world is best accounted for by an indifferent universe, because when you think about the implications of a universe with a God with those properties, it seems inconsistent, or at least very hard to reconcile with the universe as we see it. I think it's more easy to account for the moral facts of the universe as we see them by an indifferent universe. That's the argument.
I get it, but it's like children who grow up and like, my parents didn't love me, they didn't do this and that, and then at some point in their life when they have their own kids, they go, actually, my parents did love me, I was just being a 3-year-old about it. I mean, you know, once you understand that if you accept the idea that the soul is eternal and transmigrates between different bodies, this idea of suffering and like terrible suffering and everything is every bit as significant as a 3-year-old breaking a crayon. That's what Krishna says to Arjuna at the beginning of the Gita. You're lamenting for what's not worthy of grief. And it's big and significant for human beings as long as they think that they are the body. But once you actually get that you're not the body, you're an eternal spirit soul, and you're simply experiencing life after life and different things. It's like watching a movie. You watch one movie and it's Schindler's List. You watch another movie, it's X-Men. You go into another movie, it's something else. Why do filmmakers make movies with suffering in it? Because it's dramatic and it's engaging. And that's such it is for the grand drama of the universe. And we're all just like players in it. But the soul itself never suffers.
That might be a good segue into the other aspect that I wanted to discuss, because I'm not sure that we're making any progress on this particular point, which is the notion that suffering serves a greater good or a long-term purpose in helping to bring us closer to God. Because it seems like there's a lot of suffering, presumably some suffering has that effect, but there seems to be a lot of suffering that that seems quite implausible.
Do you have any, what specific examples do you have in mind?
Oh boy. Well, so how many examples do I have in mind? Well, I'm not entirely sure how your theology would respond to different cases, so maybe I'll just present a few and then see which might be most relevant. So one would be sort of various horrific diseases that children suffer. So, let's take an example. Children are born with horrific birth defects. They experience a short, very painful life and they die. How does that help them to return to God or to increase their devotedness to God? It seems that it has no effect of that whatever.
Yeah. Do you want to list more or go one at a time?
Well, I thought one at a time might be helpful, though if you prefer I go through a few to give a flavor, then perhaps I could do that as well.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
All right, so that's sort of one type. So we can also look at suffering in the animal world. So there are many horrific things that occur in the animal world, such as predation, where animals are basically, well, in many contexts, constantly stressed out or very regularly stressed out about watching for predators, and many of them will eventually suffer horrific deaths. There's other bizarre things that exist in the animal world, like sexual cannibalism, filial cannibalism, which are just horrible and have no idea why an all-loving God would make a universe with things like that in them. Then there are other natural evils like tsunamis, famines, volcanic eruptions, which just cause mass suffering at a huge level. People just can die almost all of a sudden for no apparent reason with little to no warning. I don't really see how that helps them to sort of return to God. Then there's sort of mental illnesses, which are another thing as well. So people who with schizophrenia, who experience delusions and disordered thinking and paranoia, they can't even tell what's real from what's fake. And that leads to all sorts of problems in their life. Unclear how that's helping them to return back to God. There's anxiety and depression, which I don't need to explain what those are, but where basically people's minds are disordered in a different way. And again, hard to understand, at least from my point of view, how that's helping people to return to God. Then there's horrific moral evils that are committed, like, child rapists, serial killers, genocides, mass murdering of millions of people. Hard to see why how things like that are helping people to return to God. It seems to just cause a massive amount of suffering with little to no purpose behind it. And then just as a broader point, much moral suffering actually seems to perpetuate moral suffering. So an example of this would be, a parent who abuses their child, who then grows up and learns that that's the way to respond and is sort of psychologically scarred and then abuses their own child. So instead of sort of benefiting and learning from that and growing, it actually just perpetuates a cycle of violence and abuse. And I think that we see that throughout history and society in many different ways, right? So that's just a hodgepodge of different things that seem to me to have little to no sort of purpose or directedness towards helping us to return to God.
Okay, so those are good. I'll try dealing with those as you. So I guess to preface, so the sort of way that suffering produces changes in us is that, as I mentioned, we have these experiences leave impressions on us. And these impressions are stored in what's called like the subtle body. So we have a physical body, which is just like, this body we see in the mirror, that's sort of, physical body. We have a subtle body, which is like a more sort of like, it's finer. It's composed of, we call it mind, intelligence, and our sense of egotism. So these are subtler because we can sort of intuit their existence, but we can't really perceive them with our physical senses. So we have the subtle body, and then there's also the soul. So we have the subtle body, and the subtle body goes with us from one, as we continue to migrate across bodies and reincarnate. The soul goes, and it also goes with this subtle body. So when I reincarnate into my next body, like my subtle body will stay with me. So all the impressions that we receive in one life and previous lives sort of stay with this subtle body and go with us from lifetime to lifetime. So because this subtle body is continually transmigrating along with us, the impressions that we receive in one life sort of permanently stay with us across lifetimes. So let's take the birth defects and see how this sort of relates to it. So let's say there's someone and they live a very short life, and in that life, their life was just filled with suffering and pain. Those experiences of suffering and pain leave impressions on that soul's subtle body, and they leave an impression. And when when they basically go to their next body and the body after that and the body after that, like these impressions will stay with them. So they'll have this impression of pain that persists. And this can have, number of different effects, just having the impression of pain and knowing what it's like to suffer can make you more sensitive to others when you've sort of experienced pain, and that's sort of embedded in your psyche, that this experience of pain and knowing what it's like. Then even on a subconscious level, you're less likely to want to cause harm to others, or can be less likely to cause harm to others, because you know what that pain is like, and you just intuitively and naturally don't want anyone else to experience what you've experienced. So that's how birth defects can help. They leave this impression, and that impression shapes your character across different transmigrations. That's also the case with animal suffering as well. As these animals are, in the animal kingdom and going about their life, they're getting these impressions, and these impressions leave, a mark on, they affect the subtle body. And even if they're not consciously aware then how these impressions are affecting them, they can still have their consciousness and character reformed. So like you take a child, the child when they're young, they receive various impressions, and that forms their character in certain ways. And at the time they're a child, they may not be able to consciously process how those impressions and experiences are shaping their character. But when they grow up and they're 20, 25, 30 years old, those same impressions that they received when they were younger, even though they weren't consciously processed, are now working to affect that person's behavior and character on, those impressions that they received when they were younger shape that person's character when they're older, even when they don't consciously recall them. So animal suffering can function similarly. There's, even if these animals aren't consciously aware of these impressions that they're receiving, they do leave these impressions, and when that soul moves on to another body, their character is different on account of those impressions. Natural evils, sort of a similar thing, like just the experience of pain or suffering itself, I would say, it's just another instance where these experiences of pain and suffering can be produced. So yeah, I mean, the sort of shorthand of it for these types of instances is that suffering, you develop an awareness of suffering, you know what it feels like, and you're less likely to want to cause that to others. And also suffering can help you see the nature of this world and see that this world is not really where we're meant to be. That's another major component of suffering that I could have touched upon a little bit more. But when you've really suffered in this world, as sadistic as it sounds, you can begin to see that this world is not really our true home. And you can see that, our sort of the way that we'll be happiest is not to just stay within this world and try to experience life within it, but to actually get out and turn towards God. So even from that perspective, suffering is good, even if it's temporarily negative, because it can allow us to develop a sense of detachment from this world and want us and make us want to go back to God. Let's see, mental illnesses. I think it's also sort of like a similar thing. It's maybe a little bit, that's a little bit more tricky, I guess, but you can sort of, the same reasoning can be applied to that. And anxiety and depression, I would actually, I mean, I think that's out of all the ones you mentioned, that's actually the easiest one for me to see why that would help someone turn towards God. I mean, many people, I mean, it's sort of probably well documented by now. I mean, many people, maybe they're anxious, they're depressed, and because they're looking for some sort of solution for their depression or anxiety, they take to religion, they take to spiritual practices, or they, you know, that depression serves as like an impetus for them to turn towards God, so that they can sort of, you know, find some sort of solace. I mean, some people, I mean, that some people sort of like to mention that, you know, people just turn to religion because they're depressed and it's sort of like a crutch for them. But I mean, in this context, I mean, I can see why anxiety and depression would cause someone to want to develop a relationship with God. Maybe they're suffering and they want a way out of their suffering, and for them, like developing a relationship with God and practicing some sort of spiritual practice is a good way for them to lift that depression. And yeah, so I think the strongest point you made out of these so far, though, is that much moral suffering perpetuates moral suffering. And yeah, I mean, I grant that this is actually probably one of the stronger arguments against karma, but I think there's also ways to address this as well. So one is that, you know, maybe it requires this vicious cycle to, you know, maybe for some souls, it requires a really heavy dose of sort of suffering to cause them to sort of change their character in significant ways. Like we have the saying, the straw that broke the camel's back. You know, sometimes you keep piling on and piling on and piling on things, and you only until when you reach a certain threshold does it sort of, you reach a breaking point and you get a certain effect. So, you know, maybe for some souls, it requires a gradual buildup and buildup and buildup of suffering until they reach a breaking point, and then they have a major character change. So that's one response. Another response is that because of these ideas of karma and reincarnation, we're not really able to really gauge how much someone's character has been changed as a result of violence. So from our perspective, it looks like someone's experienced violence, and that violence has made them more violent. And it seems from our perspective, without looking at what they were like in a previous life, that the violence increased their violence. But let's say, you know, hypothetically, that that same soul, that same individual who experienced violence and became more violent, was actually incredibly, incredibly, incredibly violent in a past life and has all these really violent tendencies. And they're really just like really violent. But now, because they've experienced the violence for themselves, they do have some sort of experience of what violence is like, and they can see that it's like bad to cause harm to others. But because they have such strong tendencies from a previous life, they still exhibit these tendencies nonetheless. Now, unless we are able to actually see what they were like in a previous life, we're not really able to tell whether the experience of violence reduced or increased their suffering, because for all we know, it could have been the case that they were, you know, like at a level of 10x of violence, and because of their suffering now they're at a level of 8x. You know, maybe that's the case, and we're just not able to gauge that because we're not able to see what they were like in a previous life.
Okay, so given what you've said, I think that there's, well, a potentially undesirable implication that if all of these forms of suffering have perhaps some more and some less obvious positive effects, at least, you know, over multiple lifespans, then wouldn't we be acting contrary to God's purposes to try to alleviate all this suffering?
Yeah, so one thing about karma is that it delivers suffering in a way that's beneficial for the, you know, it's like, okay, so you have let's say you have a doctor. The doctor doesn't just like whimsically prescribe random medications to patients. He gives them the medication that is particularly catered to the particular illness or malady that they have. So if we were to just cause random suffering to people, we would be like that doctor that just like throws out medications whimsically to people. The reason that karmic mechanisms are as effective as they are is because they specifically address certain character defects that people have. But because we don't know what character defects people have, it's not within our, it's not our right to just go around causing random suffering to people.
No, but that's not what I said. I'm not saying that it follows that we should cause suffering. I'm saying it seems to follow that we shouldn't attempt to alleviate suffering that God has sort of allowed to happen, or God creates karmic forces which then cause to happen, however you want to frame that. If it's serving a higher purpose, let me make it specific and sort of activate Godwin's law here. So, it seems to me pretty obvious that the Holocaust was a bad thing, right? But it seems under your view it was actually a good thing. Maybe it was evil for Hitler to do it, right? I understand you might want to make that distinction, but it seems that you're committed to the view that at least taking a long-term point of view, it served a morally good purpose. And to me, that is just an extremely implausible position.
I mean, it is a little bit callous when you frame it like that. I mean, I'm against the Holocaust. I think it's bad that it happened, but unless we're really able to.
But how can you affirm that? It seems impossible that you can affirm that, given what you've just said. It seems that it must be good that it happened, even if it was evil for Hitler to do it. I'm not saying that, because that's a different point. Well, I had to activate at some point, right? I mean, if you don't like that example, just pick a different one, right? It's not important that it's that specific example, but Genghis Khan's conquests, or the Great Leap Forward, or Armenian genocide, or whatever. Like, it seems that these were bad things to happen, and if we could have, we should have prevented them. But it seems, according to your philosophy, it was actually good that they happened, and that it would have been bad for us to prevent them, because it was effectuating these sort of karmic effects on people's, on people's willingness to turn to God over many lifetimes, at least.
Yeah, so I guess it's bad that it happened in the sense that somehow people's karmic destinies worked out, that this is what was required. But as for why we should fight to alleviate evil, I guess our tradition has an interesting response to this. I would say this. So, like, our tradition places a lot of emphasis on distributing spiritual knowledge, and sharing the knowledge of God with others. And one reason that this is beneficial in the context of this discussion is that if you can educate people to realize that their goal in life is to turn towards God, and to give them the means by which they can work on these what we call like imperfections themselves consciously, and if we can put people in touch with these spiritual practices that transform the heart, then that avoids a lot of this suffering, because when someone practices spirituality and is actively concerned about developing these qualities, and is doing practices that purify the heart, then you're saving them from having to learn lessons the hard and heavy way. So from our tradition, it's sort of like the main emphasis is maybe more on distributing this knowledge, that people don't have to learn these heavy lessons themselves. Of course, a devotee is also compassionate, and we do try to help others, and we do try to help others, but that's like, it's sort of like it's like spontaneous for someone. If a devotee is seeing someone suffering, it's just like a spontaneous thing that they'll help that person. They don't really get so much. It's not like they don't like think, they don't like sort of turn their heart off and turn their intelligence on and think, maybe it's part of their karma to do this. They're sort of just like spontaneously acting from their heart to help others. But at least this, I think one implication of karma is at least in our tradition, it's sort of course, we still try to fight suffering, but it gives us a greater impetus to fight the suffering by giving people spiritual knowledge.
So is spiritual knowledge more effective than experiencing suffering through karma in terms of redirecting people towards God?
Yes. But
you see where I'm going to go with that question, right?
Yeah, I see where you're going to go with that question. But
well, then what's the solution?
Yeah, the thing is, like, someone has to accept the knowledge. Like, all things considered, it's better if someone accepts the knowledge. Like Prabhupada, our spiritual teacher, he distinguished between 4 different types of intelligence. So the first best type of intelligence is you hear about something and you just like make the change right away. Like you hear it's bad to steal and you're like, okay, it's bad to steal. The next best type of intelligence is you see it and then you learn by seeing, basically. So you see someone steal, you see that they're punished and you're like, okay, I'm not going to steal. The third like the level of intelligence under that is you have to experience it. So you steal and then you experience the result of stealing and you see how it's bad and you learn through experience. The fourth one is like you experience it and you don't change at all. So all things considered, like if you can hear or see, then that's like much better than having to experience. But I mean, experience, like as our experience shows, like not everyone is able to learn by hearing or seeing for everything. Some people just have to experience things.
Yeah, there still seems to be a tension to me between the idea that a sort of a compassionate devotee of God will always want to alleviate suffering, and also the fact that they hold a theological view which holds that a lot of this suffering, well, actually all of this suffering, has a higher purpose that was actually for the good of people. I find that a little bit difficult to reconcile. Whereas from my point of view, just to explain why, maybe, from my point of view, when we look at the world and we see suffering, we should, if we're moral people, be motivated to try to alleviate that suffering to the maximum extent that we can. And of course, often we can't, right? But this idea that we would sort of have this idea in the back of our mind that, well, actually, there's a higher purpose for that seems to be, well, first of all, highly implausible. And second of all, that's going to make us like morally worse people if we sort of have this view that, well, actually, I don't want to press that home a bit further. Mother Teresa actually basically held this view, right? She's been criticized by people like, what's his name? Hitchens, of being a friend of poverty rather than a friend of people who are poor, because she really felt that there was sort of a spiritual value to being in poverty. I think maybe that's good because she's someone who's not within your tradition. But it seems that this is not just a hypothetical concern, that people who do hold this view about the value of suffering actually can become sort of indifferent, it seems to me, to the actual maybe indifference not quite the right word, but that they actually do morally worse because they don't focus on alleviating the sufferings in this life. At least that's from my perspective. Now, obviously, from a different theological point of view, you won't necessarily agree with that. But that's where the implausibility is coming in, at least from my point of view.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a fair point. I mean, if you can, you can basically, any worldview you have can be sort of misinterpreted or drawn upon in negative ways to support all sorts of good or bad positions. I mean, I would acknowledge that danger is there within our theological framework, but it's, it doesn't need to necessarily develop into it's not that our theology necessarily leads individuals to develop this sort of callous attitude. I mean, karma is just one aspect within the broader theological framework itself. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis given to compassion and helping others and, trying to do what one can to help others. The priorities of the heart, you could say, take precedence over the priorities of the intelligence in certain circumstances. So if someone gets a real, head-heavy view of things, of karma, maybe they can become callous. But, our theology is not to develop a real head-heavy view of things. Our theology wants us to develop a compassionate heart. And when someone has a compassionate heart, they will sort of spontaneously help people. They're not really, focus so much on the karma and, analyze things intellectually. They'll just spontaneously want to help other people. And also even from a selfish perspective, karma does give people an impetus to help others, because if you help other people, then, you're sort of liable to get a good result yourself in the next life. So there's like a selfish incentive. It's not pure, but it is one incentive that sort of offsets that. Another thing is just even spiritually, like acting in a righteous way or acting in a compassionate way helps you spiritually, because you're developing these sort of spiritual qualities that can lead you closer to God. So there are sort of, even within the theological framework, there are sort of other metaphysical incentives that can offset the sort of negative effects of karma that you described.
Fair enough. I know we have questions from the audience, and I think that's the main questions that I wanted to put forward. I don't know if Ādi, you had any questions you wanted to ask me before maybe we go to those, or where you wanted to go?
We didn't quite get to some things, but I think we covered good ground. I think problem of evil is, I'm sort of realizing it's sort of, I don't know, it's not like evil is necessarily a problem for the naturalist, for example. So it's not like I don't know, it's sort of one that I feel like the theist is sort of on the defensive about.
Well, plenty of Christian apologists say that it is, because they say that you can't make sense of evil in a naturalistic world. But I mean, I think that's nonsense. But I think that would be it's sort of a separate topic, because you can spend a long time talking about meta ethics, but not actually get to the problem of evil. So,
yeah, I mean, I think the problem of evil is sort of one that it's very much like an argument against theism. It's not, I don't know, like I find that a little bit strange. Like, I think it is one that it's more of a challenge to the theist than the naturalist. But there's also, on the flip side, there's the things that are challenges to the naturalist that aren't a challenge to the theist. So I don't know.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was actually quite surprised to hear that you actually believe in such a thing as evil, James, because at the beginning you said, I don't believe in any magical forces. I was like, but what about evil? It's like, I can, someone else mentioned in here about secular Satanism, and I was like, the problem of evil, it's just like a Slayer album, forbidden,
Yeah. I mean, I don't usually use the word evil, but I mean, it just depends how we want to articulate that. Like, in so much as I would use a concept like evil, obviously I would understand it in, naturalistic or materialist terms. So that's why I generally prefer suffering. But again, for this debate, we didn't really make a strong distinction between them. So I'm not really going to make a big point of that.
I think someone did mention it in here. We might get to it in these questions. If you guys are okay with it, I think it's a great suggestion to go to questions now. Okay, so people have asked questions and they've directed them to different people. So the first one here from Digital Gnosis, and this is a question for you, James. If you were wrong and God was using the suffering of the world to build souls, how would you find out?
Yeah, this is a very good question. I think so the short answer is I have no idea. The longer answer is I think this is actually the problem with a lot of theology, and theodicies in particular, is that there doesn't seem any way of falsifying it or basically testing whether it's true or not. The only way I could think of is basically to see if the theodicy entails other beliefs that in some way can be tested. When I say tested, I don't mean like, conduct an experiment necessarily, but just whether there's any other evidence or facts of the matter or arguments that we could bring to bear on it. So it seems like potentially the Hare Krishna theodicy does make certain claims. Like, for example, in response to certain types of suffering, Ādi mentioned that the concept of reincarnation is important to understand how these lead us back to God. Well, depending on how we want to understand reincarnation and whether that may be something that can be tested or not, then, or whether there's arguments for and against whether that could occur, that might be something we could examine. So the point is, if the theodicy entails beliefs that we can sort of test in other ways, that would be how I'd go about looking at that. But by itself, I mean, if someone just asserts, well, God has these purposes and he can't act in this way and he can act in this way and he does it, because I can't examine God, I don't know how I would tell if that's true or not.
Okay. I kind of got that was like a detailed explanation to come to the point of, I don't know how you'd find out at the moment.
That's why I said the short answer is I have no idea.
Yes.
The long answer is
here's
what I just said.
Exactly. I got it. Okay, well, the shoe is now on the other foot. Ādi, if you had a false belief and there was no soul building or karma or God, how would you find out? The short answer and the long answer, please.
Okay, that's a good question. So I think maybe the long answer will be easy to give than the short answer. So I think you first have to, how do you know anything, first of all? And, if you're an advocate of like verificationism, then you might say, the only way you can know anything is by like empirically proving it. Like, if you can't empirically prove it, then it's not, it's not true. But there's a lot of beliefs that are simply not able to be empirically verified or disconfirmed. So, like, how do we prove that this world is real and we're not a brain in a vat? Like, you can't really prove that through empirical reasoning. How do you prove that this world is actually as old as scientists say it is and it wasn't just created 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age and memories? Like, there's no way to really go about proving that. So for some beliefs, like the way we know them is maybe reasoning or intuition, or we have experiences that support it and cohere with it. So, I mean, my belief ultimately in the Hare Krishna theology is that my experiences are such that I've had, powerful religious experiences that cohere with the Hare Krishna theology and support it. and drawing on my intuitions, my intuitions tell me that these experiences are what they appear to be, and not just some sort of hallucination. And those experiences sort of support the scriptures within our tradition. Everything. I follow the scriptures in our tradition, and I get results, and my experiences are consistent with these scriptures. And I have found that by accepting scriptures, I have a coherent worldview, and I have experiences to support it. So that's at least how I sort of justify my belief in these types of things. And also, nothing that I've really found has like challenged the internal consistency or the consistency of it, or has seriously threatened my beliefs also. So, for a number of factors, that's sort of my response.
Okay. So kind of like the long version of, I don't know, and furthermore, you can't know. It's kind of like I heard Gödel's incompleteness theorem in there. Like it's impossible to actually verify
maybe the short is like
with itself.
Yeah, maybe the short is that, I don't know, you can have powerful religious experiences that sort of support scripture. Maybe that's like the short of it.
Okay. Here we go. This is about that point you made earlier, James, about is it going to replace it? Yeah, isn't all suffering gratuitous on naturalism? Why should the theist become a naturalist if their belief absorbs the sufferings of life in their experience?
Why should the theist become a naturalist if their belief absorbs the suffering of life in their experience? I'm going to interpret that as meaning that, according to their Theodicy, that they believe that they can understand the sufferings of life, maybe supported by experience. Well, so this comes down to the argument that I sort of presented and didn't necessarily defend directly, but I think sort of talking about it in the context, in the course of the discussion, which is basically that I think that the hypothesis of an indifferent universe better accounts for the sufferings that we see in the world. Basically, I regard the theodicies that I've heard as unsatisfactory and ad hoc, and I think that they're worse explanations than the explanation I put forward about the indifferent universe. Obviously, to fully address that, you'd have to have a series of 20 discussions about all sorts of different issues, that because these things all need to relate with each other, right? But the short answer is, yeah, I think that I don't necessarily think the problem of evil, as I said at the start, I don't think it's a decisive argument. So I don't necessarily think it should cause a theist to become a naturalist. I do think that I guess what I'd say is a theist who responds rationally to the evidence would reduce their confidence in an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God as a result of these considerations.
So you're essentially saying that they should give, even though they derive a benefit from their theism in terms of absorbing the experience of suffering in their life, they should give that up to directly and rawly experience the pain and suffering on the basis of logic?
I haven't actually made a claim about what theists should or shouldn't believe. What I was talking about is the issue of sort of the epistemic warrant that a theistic view has, and my claim is that an argument from the existence of suffering, like the one I put forward, when properly considered and discussed, should cause one to reduce the confidence, the epistemic confidence one has in a theistic hypothesis. What sort of end position that leaves you is really quite a separate question.
Okay, yeah, I got it. So this is kind of leading us in the direction of this next question, which is from Oscar, this idea of regardless of the truthiness of this theistic idea, its actual impact on people's experience of life and dealing with suffering. And Oscar asks, does your religion actually help with depression, Ādi? Are there any studies on this? I know, James, you mentioned anxiety and depression as forms of suffering.
Yeah, even some anecdotal experience, I was fairly depressed before coming into contact with Krishna consciousness, and then through Krishna consciousness, I'm much happier than what I was before. So personal experience, I can tell you yes. Even sociologically, they have done studies. I'm not an expert on all these studies, but they do correlate religiosity with some positive indicators of well-being. I'm sure you'll find studies that show that people are probably less depressed because of it. I mean, it's a little bit hard because I don't know if anyone's done one just on Hare Krishna, and even within Hare Krishna, there's different communities and different groups and a lot of factors to take into consideration. But I mean, personally, like at least my own anecdotal experience is that people become much happier when they take to Krishna consciousness, is what I've observed.
Okay, great. Okay, here's a good one. This is again from Oscar, earlier up, another double header. First to James, how good would the world need to be for you to doubt the indifference hypothesis?
A good question, although I would say that we have to be wary here of the fallacy of the continuum. So I can't say how good it would have to be, right? I guess the idea is that the better it is, or the less apparently pointless suffering there is, then the less forceful the argument is. So I guess a short answer would be, if the world didn't have any of the examples of apparently purposeless suffering that I mentioned, disease, natural disasters, horrors of the animal world, particularly horrific forms of moral evil, then the argument would be significantly less weighty. Now, of course, there'd still be other forms of evil and suffering, but at least the argument would be less forceful to the extent that the most heinous forms or the most purposeless and extreme forms of suffering had been removed. So I see it as a sort of a spectrum.
Imagine if we were living in the clouds with harps playing and all that kind of stuff, I'd probably want to kill myself to get out of there. Ādi, your turn. How much horror or suffering would the world need to have for you to doubt the omnibenevolence hypothesis?
I think we'd need to have a substantial amount more. I mean, one reason that the indifference hypothesis doesn't move me so much is because, as I mentioned, that our theology has this idea that we're in Kali Yuga. So that sort of gives you a way to sort of account for large amounts of suffering through these types of, I don't know, when you sort of view the world with this sort of Kali Yuga lens, you can sort of absorb more suffering into your worldview, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think on the whole, I mean, there is a lot of suffering, but there is also a lot of good. I think it would have to be pretty much all suffering, or at least I don't know, at least 75 to 90, I don't know, to 100% of just sheer torturous suffering. But
Ādi, how would it doesn't seem to me that any amount of suffering would refute your view, because it could just be, well, that's the amount it takes, right, to turn people toward God. It could be maximum suffering all the time for a few lifetimes until, I don't see how that would refute your view.
Yeah, I mean, that's also, I think maybe emotionally, if there was a lot of suffering, it would sort of be hard, but intellectually, I think my worldview sort of can handle large amounts of suffering.
This is where you got to pull out the 5th canto, where it describes planets where people go for thousands of years, and it's made out of copper and it's heated from the inside, and they have to keep running around it, and their feet are burning the whole time. Yeah. I mean, if you read into that stuff, there's a huge amount of suffering in there. But even from what you were describing, James, if you drill down into the down to the insect world and the animal kingdom, every single, how many animals die of natural causes? No, well, they all die of natural causes, right? But it's basically being eaten by another animal or starving to death.
Yeah, or disease.
Okay, after we went to Godwin, we got a bunch of stuff in here that we're not bringing up on the screen. Brain in a vat and last Tuesdayism in one sentence. Okay, that was more of a comment. Okay, this is after the Godwin kind of started. This is what Stephen Law calls going nuclear. Let's have a look.
Maybe there should be a rule against this, keep your examples PG.
Nah,
it's a bit hard when the whole point of the argument is about heinous suffering, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
If I just had to use PG examples, the force of the argument I don't think would go through.
Susie stubbed her toe in the garden, and
Yeah, well, and to be honest, some theists do use, maybe not quite that, but they do use examples of fairly benign suffering where you can easily see, well, you know, you go through that and you're better after it. But like those to me don't, if that's all the world had, then I think that maybe this relates to a question before. If that's the level of suffering that we had, then I think that would be much more plausible under the theistic hypothesis. But I think that the real force of the argument that I'm making comes from, yeah, the heinous and apparently purposeless suffering.
Yeah, the visceral connection.
Yeah. There are other questions?
Yeah, here's another one from Oscar. Consider a God that is omnipotent, omniscient, and omni-loves when things are pink. Would the actual world be some evidence against my hypothesis?
Who is this directed towards?
I've got no idea.
Well, I actually think this is a good question if I'm understanding it correctly. So let me interpret this my way. I don't know if this is how it was intended, but so suppose that we postulated such a God, right? It would seem that the actual world is not very consistent with the existence of such a God because most things aren't pink, right? If the God omni loves when things are pink, then you'd expect way more pink things and way less not pink things, right? Now, I think the analogy could be made that, well, if, you know, God is all good, then you'd expect a universe much more consistent with things being good. Whereas in fact, that there are heaps of things that are not good. And in fact, almost the extreme opposite of that. So that's my interpretation of that question, which I think is a good analogy. But I mean, I feel like you've sort of already answered that. It's just another way to ask the question that I've asked.
I mean, I think, so I see what this argument or this question is trying to do, but, you know, let's say that in the sort of scriptures you adhere to, there are reasons why this world has less pink than you would expect. Then I think in the light of maybe those scriptural teachings, then the actual world might not necessarily be evidence against that hypothesis. If you have a good reason why there's less pink things than what you would expect.
Ready for the next one? Ādi, how could you tell the difference between God allowing a devotee to escape the laws of karma versus no laws of karma or God and only natural stuff happening, which I believe is James's position? How could you tell a difference between those two things?
I think in my own personal experience, when you're sort of attuned to these laws of karma, you can actually correlate things. You can start to correlate things in your life. Like something happens and you sort of can realize, oh, like my consciousness was bad the other day. I was doing these things. I did this to that other person. And now I'm getting a taste of my own medicine now. There's sort of like an experiential component to it that you can start to be attuned to as time goes on.
How is that not apophenia? Like just, you know, seeing coincidences and like conspiracy theory, basically, you know, constructing a conspiracy theory about it.
I think when you have a set of maybe unlikely or improbable coincidences over and over and over again, the probability that it's sheer coincidence goes down and the probability that there's something else at play goes up. Like, I don't know, like if it's, like maybe you have some sort of experience and you get like a reaction to it, and that reaction is like some sort of like really strange kind of spooky coincidence. But then, you know, every day of your life, you have like a weird, rare, spooky coincidence, and the amount of opportunities to have these coincidences is not very high. Then, you know, the chance that it's just like all these really improbable, spooky things happening over and over and over and over and over again seems kind of unlikely on a just like random basis.
Okay. I'm not really an atheist, but I'm not very convinced by that. Because, I mean, you know, what defines a spooky coincidence? It's just something that you make up. Yeah, it's an interpretation, isn't it?
Well, that might be the topic for another debate, right? We'd talk about what those are. Yeah. I feel like that's 3 more debates worth of analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah, what was that point? Sorry, what was that question that you spoke to, James, and you said in order to get to that question, we'd have to have 20 more debates? What was do you remember that? Why, I don't remember. Oh, sorry. Yeah, why a theist should give up their theism when it impacts their experience of suffering based on naturalism.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea there is just that our worldviews form a well, hopefully, a coherent system of beliefs that answer a wide range of questions. And so whenever we address a single question, like, I mean, as Ādi was doing here, when I was asking these questions about suffering and the nature of good and free will, he drew upon his theology to account for those. Now, to me, that's not going to be persuasive. I don't agree with his theology, right? But for him, it is, because he already has those beliefs to draw upon. So to show why I don't agree with that, then I'd have to go, okay, well, why does he believe these things? And then we'd discuss those. And then there'd probably be a whole bunch of other things that he would appeal to, right? So you can never really address someone's worldview holistically, because you can kind of only talk about one thing at a time. Over a course of discussions, you can maybe address different areas and then try to assess it as a whole, although it's still difficult. But that's just what I mean, that we'd have to look at lots of other issues. So that's, again, why I say that the argument I'm advocating shouldn't be decisive, and I don't think necessarily should convince theists to not be theists. But I do think that, on its own, considered in its own right, it should reduce a theist's confidence in what they believe.
Interesting approach. So it's not just like shouting at people that they're wrong and like convincing the audience to throw tomatoes at them. Okay, revolutionary idea about dialogue there. Radical. I think that's pretty much the questions that we had, and we are at the top of the second hour. Okay, this is back to that point. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong one there. Tarot cards, yeah, we can forget about that one too. It's a discussion for another day, as James said. So yeah, we're at the top of the hour. We got like 5 minutes left. Do you guys want to make a summary? And one thing that we've been doing is having the interlocutors summarize the position of the other party to make sure that they've understood it, so they present it, and then the other person can like say, yep, that's it, or, a correction if anything is needed. Would you guys be happy to do that?
Yeah, sure.
Putting us on the spot there. Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
Have you been listening? I know you have.
Who's going first?
Rock, paper, scissors?
I'll go first if you like. I'm happy to go first.
Okay, sure.
I mean, because it's sort of what I was going to do anyway, like explain what you were saying and then sort of some of my concerns. So let me do my best here to explain some of what we've talked about. Oops. So one thing that I started by asking Ādi about is like, what is the nature of good, essentially? And what Ādi was saying is that the greatest good is for us to enter into a sort of loving relationship with God. And because God is the greatest being. And that was all right with me as far as that went. But then I asked a question about why God doesn't either create or sustain souls that just always will choose to do that. And we had a lengthy discussion about whether that's the sort of thing that would be logically consistent or possible. Ādi seems to hold the view that that wouldn't be logically possible for God to do. Whereas I was unpersuaded why it would be impossible. We talked about the possibility of doing otherwise. I don't think that that's necessarily impedes on God's ability to do this, but Ādi seemed to think that it did. So that was, I think, where we reached that. Is that correctly summarizing your view on that point?
Yeah, it's fair.
Yeah. And then we talked a bit about the purpose of natural and moral evils or suffering sort of in this world. And Ādi was sort of making the argument about how through the operation of karmic forces, these effects are able to, experiencing suffering over time and over lifespans allows us to, or brings about a change in people's hearts, at least many people, to sort of eventually redirect them to sort of decide to be more receptive to God and ultimately sort of return as devotees to Him. I had a number of concerns there. One was, a major one was why God can't just directly actualize the effect of basically turning these people, these souls back to God. And Ādi was of the view, I think that that's just not something God would be able to do, whereas I wasn't persuaded that there was a clear reason why He wouldn't be able to do that. And I think we just sort of had an impasse there. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then we talked a bit more about specifically how different types of evils, particularly ones that I mentioned about that seem to be particularly hard to understand, how they could bring about sort of moral improvement or directing us toward God, about how that would work. And Ādi mentioned a number of different possibilities. I think many of them did involve the notion of reincarnation and effects in subsequent lives. Now, I guess, from my point of view, not believing in reincarnation and these other things, that seems an ad hoc answer, but I obviously accept that within his framework, he accepts these things. I guess my concern is still that it seems to lead to the conclusion that we would need to, in some sense, affirm that these really horrible forms of suffering are in some sense good, which seems to be implausible to me. But Ādi seem to have the view that there's sort of a sense in which they're good, but another sense in which they're not, and that correctly interpreted could be sort of reconciled in a consistent way. Is that fair?
Yeah.
So those were sort of the main points that I wanted to. Maybe I'll just sort of summarize what I take my argument to be doing. So as I said, my argument was that I think that the existence of apparently pointless suffering in the world is better explained by an indifferent universe than a universe with an omnibenevolent, an omniscient, an omnipotent God. That is not decisive evidence for naturalism or against theism, but I think it's sort of powerful evidence and should cause us to be less confident that theism is true. And I think that the theodicies that I've heard, including Ādi's, I just find ad hoc and not very plausible, and to have internal issues of coherence and consistency, which is why I'm ultimately not persuaded. But I really appreciate the discussion and taking the time. I thought it was really interesting, and I learned more about Hare Krishna theology, which is good.
So yeah, you pretty much did a good job summing that up. Not much I can add. You seem to cover the points pretty well. I think, the main takeaway is that the problem of evil is sort of intended to reduce the likelihood of theism, or to sort of reduce one's confidence that it's true, which is how the problem of evil has been taken. I mean, of course, if you had to compare naturalism and theism, the problem of evil is just like one factor of it. There's other arguments and other things to take into consideration, and there's also arguments. The problem of evil is an arguments against theism. There's arguably arguments against naturalism, for example. So, but yeah, I mean, I think you covered those points pretty well. And yeah, your view is basically that the problem of evil should reduce our confidence in theism.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. Ādi, I acknowledge you for being out there on the internet doing the work of the good Lord Krishna. And James, for you being out there preaching the word of the indifferent universe. Reason.
David Hume, we'll go with that.
David Hume. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for creating such a dynamic discussion, and also bringing this kind of like commitment to understanding rather than like winning at all costs. I really appreciate that. And I know that a lot of the listeners, both live this evening and millions of people on the internet, some of them not even born yet, who will be watching this once they reinvent power and dig the archives out from underneath the Arctic.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank you both. Go forth, be fruitful and multiply. Stay safe, and look forward to seeing you on debates in the near future.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. I appreciated this discussion a lot.
Thanks to all the live listeners. Oscar, Digital Gnosis, Titan Uranus, Al Ra, Bouncy House, Joshua Benjamin, and others for